Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Ciecko, and I'm the founder of Cuseum. First off, I want to say thank you to everyone who is joining us today, our speakers and our attendees. Over 3,700 people have registered for today's conversation, and I look forward to this open dialogue. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome. And for those of you who have tuned into any of our past webinars, welcome back. It's always great to see you. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the injustice and the state of civil unrest. I know many of you are feeling a range of emotions, sadness, anger, tensions, uncertainty, and I recognize how hard and heavy the past few weeks have been on top of a pandemic. Across the nation and the world, we are mourning the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor with sadness and distress. These recent events have further illuminated the systemic injustice that remains entrenched in our country and its institutions, not just for decades, but centuries. And many of us have shown solidarity with Black Lives Matter and the Black community. Many of us had said now is the time to recognize and make right with the many groups that have suffered from injustice. Many of us have taken action or made small steps towards greater action. And I hope all of us have agreed that there's work to be done and this isn't a passing moment. To quote James Baldwin, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And this is a moment for us and our institutions to face systemic injustice, to do something about it, and to set our cultural sector on the path it should have been on ages ago. I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic, and I feel this way because our world is filled with individuals who have dedicated their lives professionally and personally to addressing social justice, fostering inclusion, and promoting civil rights. And today I'm here to listen and learn, just like many of you who are tuning in today. And I commit myself and my company to amplify these voices and to take action. So the goal coming out of this is to be better and to acknowledge the fact that there's substantial work to be done, and it all starts with a conversation. So without further ado, please let me introduce our guest speakers for today. Joining us, we have Terri Freeman. Terri Lee Freeman was appointed president of the National Civil Rights Museum in November of 2014. As president, she is responsible for providing strategic leadership in furthering the museum's mission as an educational and cultural institution. During her short tenure, Terri has emphasized the connection between the historic civil rights era and today's contemporary issues. Terri has placed her emphasis on building the organization's reputation as the new public square. Through her collaborative approach to the work, she has increased the visitor engagement with the museum's public programs by 4 times. Prior to the National Civil Rights Museum, Terri worked both in community and corporate philanthropy, providing and serving as president of the Community Foundation for the National Capital Region in Washington, D.C., and as the founding executive director of the Freddie Mac Foundation, where she developed an intense passion for the nonprofit sector and community. A graduate of the 2016 class of Leadership Memphis, Terri serves on several boards, including the Community Foundation of Greater Memphis, the Orpheum Theater Group, New Memphis Institute, Memphis Brand Initiative, Urban Teachers, and the Southeastern Council of Foundations. Terri received her bachelor's degree in journalism and communication arts from the University of Dayton and her master's degree in organizational communications from Howard University. She's married to Dr. Bower G. Freeman and is the proud mother of 3 daughters and 3 grandchildren. Thank you so much for joining us, Terri.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And you're actually the first person to be on 2 of our webinars. So gold star on that. Thank you. And then joining us from Philadelphia, we have Damon Reaves. Damon Reaves is the Interim Senior Curator of Education at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He has a background in visual art, working in drawing, painting, and installation. He earned a Master's of Fine Arts degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 2008, where he was awarded the Locke's Postgraduate Fellowship. Prior to his current role, he was the Associate Curator of Education for Community Engagement and Access. He has previously served as the Director of Community Engagement at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston and as a teaching artist for the City of Philadelphia's Mural Arts Program. In 2019, he was guest faculty at the Banff Center, trainings for the Not Yet residency. Damon has presented on several panels, including Who is We? Intersection Engagement and Equity Efforts in Philadelphia Art Institutions, and the Living Agreement. He was a collaborator on Philadelphia Assembled, a large-scale social practice work, and sought to highlight moments of resistance and resilience in a rapidly changing city. Thanks for joining us, Damon. Thank you. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Damon. Also joining us, we have Cecile Shellman. Cecile is a full-time consultant in diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion for museums. She recently worked in a leadership capacity for Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, heading initiatives at Carnegie Museum of Art, Carnegie Museum of Natural History, Carnegie Science Center, and the Andy Warhol Museum. Selected past appointments include Director of Visual Arts and Exhibitions at the August Wilson Center for African American Culture, Program Manager for Pittsburgh Public Schools Culturally Responsive Arts Education Initiative, Education Coordinator at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, Director of Education at the Heckscher Museum of Art in New York, and Education Curator at the Museum of Church History and Art in Salt Lake City, Utah. She holds a CMS from Harvard University and a BFA in painting from Brigham Young University. She was named an American Alliance of Museums Facing Change Senior Diversity Fellow in 2019, and she is a licensed as a qualifying administrator for Intercultural Development Inventory, the premier research-based cultural competence assessment. Thank you so much, Cecile, for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you. And lastly, I'm Brendan Ciecko. I'm the founder and CEO of Cuseum. I'll be your host for today's conversation. So let's open up the dialogue today with a question for Terri. At the National Civil Rights Museum, your mission and wealth of educational content, both on-site and online, which very much intersects with the national reckoning around systemic racism and injustice in this very moment. How do you see your role in this time in society, in the world, and in the cultural sector at large?
Well, Brendan, you read that the museum kind of considers itself the new public square. So given that, during the protests that actually are continuing, many of them have started or ended at the National Civil Rights Museum. I think most impressively over the past weekend, while we are still closed because of the pandemic, we have not yet reopened. They wanted to utilize the space for a convening of, to do civil disobedience training. And so we have a courtyard, obviously, at the museum, and we opened that courtyard up and had probably about 300 individuals who participated in that civil disobedience training. And then they left from the museum and immediately went and had a demonstration of what they had learned. So it really is a place where people can take the history, the lessons from the movement of the mid 20th century and apply them to what's going on now. I do like to inform people that as they talk about what they're seeing now, you hear a lot of people say, well, what's the strategy? There's no strategy. What do they want? All the rest of this sort of stuff. And what I remind people of is that in the mid 20th century, there were factions, there was confusion, there were different methods, and that history and time always puts a beautiful veneer on everything, right? But being in it, it was really no different than what we are seeing today. So using the space as a public square, using the space to teach about how organizing was done in the mid 20th century is helpful to the activist community. And actually even seeing the different activists come into the space, we have had a smaller meeting inside the space to allow them to say, okay, these are the things that we're working on right now. What are you working on? So allowing them to have that space as a place, frankly, for them to strategize.
Thank you. Thank you. And, as this is a time of pain and anxiety and distress, especially for our Black community members, friends, and colleagues, how can organizations support their staff as well as their communities and constituents right now? I know, Damon, you had a lot to say on this yesterday.
Yeah, and forgive me, I will occasionally be muting. I do have a dog sitting next to me that will usually try to chime in with her own thoughts. This is a tough question to answer, and I think when we did our planning conversation yesterday, I might have had one response, and there's been some things in my own personal world that have complicated my thoughts on this matter. But I think the most important thing I think that we can always do is listen. And actually, what does it mean to truly listen? This sounds a little bit like old school, like going back to elementary school, but listen is one of those words that we throw around a lot, but a lot of people claim it and sort of say it, but are not very good at actually doing it. Really, what does it mean to give up space? To realize when your voice isn't the primary voice that's needed in the space or at the table. And this isn't about shifting labor or shifting ownership onto someone else. So it's not about putting, particularly, like I think in this particular moment, putting Black staff or staff of color in situations where they are to do the heavy lifting and they are to do the work and they are to lead everyone on up the mountainside and to have a great sort of moment with it. I think it is more about what does it mean to actually make space. And sometimes you're making space for people to talk. Sometimes you're making space for people to grieve. Sometimes you're making space for people to be silent and to hold that silence. It's realizing the multiplicity of voices that exist in the space and and really taking that moment to listen, I think is step one. And then how do you act on what you're hearing and what you're receiving? How do you receive that graciously and humbly? And then obviously the next step is taking real action. Right? That is, it goes beyond just sort of the kind of discussion point, but taking really action steps. But I can't stress, number one, I think is making space to truly listen. What does it mean to just, I know for me, sorry, and I'm babbling a little bit, but I know for me, like, I just needed some time to grieve. And that wasn't a time to be asked what the next step should be or to be told what people were going to do as their next action step. That was actually one of the most frustrating things that I personally experienced, where people were telling me, and then I will be doing this. And I kind of felt like saying, I don't need to know what you're doing right now. I kind of need you to give me a moment. I'm going to need collectively as a community a moment. So how do you make space for that? How do you actually step back and allow that real listening to happen? I think that's just a big starting.
Yeah, Cecile, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, because I imagine you're involved in these conversations, not with one, not but two, but dozens of organizations over the years. So I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you. And yes, not only have I been involved with many institutions over the years, but at this critical juncture and, in this COVID-informed world, we've all been experiencing, this very unprecedented, very harrowing and uncertain time. And then compounded is, what we have witnessed in the last couple of weeks, but of course, what we have been enduring for centuries. And the trauma of that, requires that we are empathetic towards our colleagues, towards, especially in particular with our white colleagues and leaders as they relate to us and those who are, newly and again, re-traumatized by, just seeing and hearing and, just undergoing all of what we have been doing this past couple of weeks. And so what can be learned from this pandemic, the global pandemic, is that we need to understand that some people are going to, as Damon said, require space. We're going to need to understand that some people may just not be able to have their faces on that next, Zoom conference. We may not be able to, open up with everyone else or attend a meeting. We may need that time. And not just in this moment, but, as things move on. And if people are serious about their statements, if they're really making statements saying that they're going to be connected with the Black community and they're going to do this and that. Work internally first, right? And be aware of your staff and be aware of, make space for them and make sure they're included and that they feel that you care about them. Empathy cannot be stressed enough at this time.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, last week I was reading a piece in Fast Company by Linda Ong, who's a Chief Cultural Officer of the Civic Entertainment Group, and she wrote, and it really stood out to me, and I quote, "We need brands to behave like activists. Protests have once again sought racial discrimination and criminalization of Black citizens. Companies can't be content to offer reassurance or feel-good messages." And this really stood out to me because I know we're in this period where there's a lot of empty statements and there's a lot of, statements with no action to back them. And I want to, loop this back because I know, Terri, when you were talking about the role that your museum has, historically, but its role now with activists, I'd love to hear, do you think, we need museums to act like or behave like activists? Is what's happening right now. I know some people say this is activism, this is political. Some people are saying, no, this is human rights. This is civil rights. This is human rights. It's not political. So I'm curious, what does that commitment or shift look like? And what does that idea of a museum, if companies, who are for-profit generating entities that aren't as mission aligned or mission aligned like these cultural institutions, as we know are, if a company should be acting like an activist, shouldn't then a museum be acting like an activist? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on that.
Well, I certainly think that museums should be serving as a place where people can listen. That's for sure. I actually told a couple of people, I said, if you're going to do a statement, but you don't really have any plan on talking about what you're going to do differently, you might as well not do the statement from my perspective. I mean, thank you. We're happy that you're with us, but if you're not going to change anything, then don't waste your paper and don't go through the issue of trying to deal with how you're going to promote whatever it is that you're saying in this statement. I really think that people should take a moment and say, what do I need to do differently? Because you're right, this is a human rights issue. This is not a political statement in any way, shape, or form. You may not even want to take a stand with regard to the potential policy changes that can occur. But what are you doing within your place of employ, in your museum? Is there a way that you can bring forward the voices of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color that maybe you have not before, right? So are there ways that you can lift up that community based on what it is that your museum is actually focused on? And we should be doing that anyway. As we, I talk about the National Civil Rights Museum not as African American history, it's American history. And the sooner we are able to recognize that, the better off we will be. So I think a part of what museums have to do is look at, okay, what is my business? What is it that I do, and how then can I lift up this community that certainly in some instances has not been allowed to be a part of that museum, if you understand what I'm saying. All of us could do, my museum included, could do a better job of listening to our own communities and giving them what they want in the museum. And just because we are a museum that talks about history of people who look like me, it really doesn't mean that we always get it right with regard to how we interact with our community. So I frankly discourage people from making statements. It's probably too late by now. Everybody in the world has made a statement by now, but I discourage statements without some specific actions. And I agree when I think Damon was talking about beginning inside your organization. Start with the people who work there and understand that people are hurting, people are angry, people are confused, and I'm sure in some instances people are embarrassed. So I think we have to start there and work inside, and then we can kind of manifest our way outside of the organization.
Can I I just want to co-sign everything Terri's just said for putting it in such amazing language. You know, there's a phrase that Jill Scott uses that I love when she's doing spoken word. She said once, "Holler if you hear it and when you feel it," and literally everything you were saying was having those moments for me, you know. And I agree with you. I was feeling very much the same when these messages started rolling out. I found myself sitting back saying, why am I reading all of this right? It felt disingenuous and dishonest. It felt rushed because I'm like, you didn't figure that out in one night, what changes you need to make or what things you need to figure out or where you need to go. I'd rather have you take some time, be silent, figure it out, and come back with something that's actionable and real and sincere, even if it's acknowledging the fact of like, I don't know what's happening next, you know, but we know that that something has to change. You know, and I always sort of understand that there's a multiplicity of voices, right? That there's multiple feelings that, you know, I think it's important for us to always sort of say out loud, you know, that the Black community is not a monolithic experience and we don't all have sort of the same opinions or thoughts on this. But, you know, I just know for me personally, like I find myself, you know, turning on my Amazon Fire Stick and seeing the sort of statement from Amazon of Black Lives Matter and seeing it on some signs as I go by. And sometimes it does feel like solidarity and other times it feels like re-traumatization in some ways. Because I'm just sort of like, you know, I find myself saying, okay, company, what are you actually doing? Or why are you saying this to me right now? And what is this relationship that you're trying to engage with? So I could not agree with more.
Thank you. And talking a little bit about, you know, statements and the weight of statements and the weight of words and the decisions going on and the complexity of that all, you know, it seems right now, it's really, you know, some would say there is no option to stay silent or exist as a bystander or watch from the sidelines essentially. And besides being silent, I've seen just over the last couple of weeks, some museums are trying to take a neutral position, which are, you know, I want to make clear are two distinctly different things, silence and neutrality. And I've seen statements from museum directors, you know, stating that they don't have a political stance, which maybe even suggests that there's some political, you know, nature of this all, which we've already, you know, covered a couple minutes back, and they want to stay nonpartisan at all. I've seen statements that have been criticized for being overly generic, you know, across the board. And I've seen no statements at all from some organizations and some companies and individuals. So I'd imagine there are museums and museum professionals who feel similarly. They either don't know what to do, it's a confusing time, they want to see what happens, or maybe they don't want to rock the boat or get involved with things that are outside of their missions focus, if one wants to just simplify things that way, or it could be deemed political or at least politicized by their communities, their staff or their leadership, or, you know, let's not forget their board and their funders. How we talk, you know, can we talk a little bit about or organizations that are considering to stay silent or claim to be neutral, or, you know, what distinction you'd make there? Because I realize this is a, you know, such a multifaceted moment around action, first and foremost action, but the communication around that action or communications in general. I know that's a really kind of heavy way to look at it, but it seems like we're all, you know, I've gotten a ton of questions from museum professionals that, you know, don't know where to turn right now, and they don't want to appear to be putting out a statement that could be deemed empty. And I know it's a really, you know, it's a challenging, you know, place to be. So I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this, because I imagine everyone's put out a statement and has seen the statements and reacted to the statements. So Cecile, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Sure. And thank you very much, Brendan. And if I may, I want to kind of loop back a little bit to the earlier question about the Fast Company article, to speak to that, as well as maybe give us a different viewpoint, because I want to hark back to history and think about back in 2014, you know, actually 2013, 7 years ago, when the Black Lives Matter movement was founded. And then the following year, after, you know, the killing of the young teenager in Ferguson. And many museums and other arts organizations were actually thinking about writing statements. And I know because I was in one of them. And, you know, that was a time that nationally, similar to, you know, to the situation with the killing of George Floyd, but with so much outcry and passion. And finally, there seemed to be a point where people were understanding that, you know, this could not continue. Some arts organizations were asking, should we write a statement? And it took the African American Association of Museums. They were the first one in the museum world to write a statement, actually giving a position. And, you know, I want us to talk a little bit about culture, because in museum cultures, we do defer to authority, and we do wait for others before we will then commit to doing something. And, you know, over the last 8 or 10 years, some museums have been working on their diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, all of this. And some have been writing internal statements, and some have been making forays into, you know, doing some introspection and understanding what they will do. And so I wouldn't say that, you know, like Amazon or, you know, some of these corporate companies, that museums haven't been doing some of that work, because if they have, then they have the right to at least assert what they're doing and to make a statement that will be, that they will have to be held accountable to. I think that's important, to make a statement, but you have to be accountable, and someone has to hold you accountable. And by someone, I mean lots of someones. I mean internally in your staff, your peers, your colleagues, your others in the field. And that's the only way that it will be actionable, because, you know, it's not just about a moment, right? It's not about 2014, and it's not about, you know, the hashtag museums respond to Ferguson, which then led to a lot of toolkits. It led to museums and race. It led to, in 2016, at AAM's annual meeting, there was a meeting that I was involved in, at which we all got together with the leadership, with the board of trustees and the president of AAM, and said, what are we going to do about this? Is this now going to be something that, you know, we'll have all museums required to do? I mean, what should we do about anti-racism? What should we do about anti-oppression? And unless it's voiced, and that can be by virtue of a statement, or, you know, in board rooms, or, you know, executive leadership teams, or among staff, then, you know, it doesn't really have that, you know, it won't have that purchase, it won't have that grip. So I strongly believe that there is a place for that, and museums can and should be activists. You know, I'm disappointed when museums say, I will not sign on to that. I don't believe that Black Lives Matter. I've heard this more than once, you know, over the last few weeks, and it's been horrifying. But at the same time,
well, we need to know who those people are, Cecile. So
that's right, because they also need to be held accountable. And there actually have been some good news coming out of that. You know, people have said, people have been persuaded. But again, you have to back it up. If you don't back it up, they're not. That's right. Whitney says here that you have to call them out, right? So I'm not going to call them out and but back it up. Well, you know, they can be persuaded.
Well, I'd love to dive a little bit into the topic that you brought up, Cecile, about the importance of accountability. Anonymous attendee asked a question, and over 100 people have upvoted it, which means it's a critical thing they want to, you know, learn about and hear perspective from the three of you on. Is, you know, my museum, anonymous attendee says, my museum has released a statement of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you have any recommendations on keeping my institution accountable?
I don't want to keep talking. I don't know if my fellow panelists here have ideas. I do have some thoughts on it, but and Brendan, you can be the one to say. But
you can go ahead.
Damon,
go ahead.
Damon,
Cecile.
do you want to?
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Cecile. Go for it.
Okay, certainly. Thanks.
Start
So this can't happen without dialogue. I think Brendan mentioned, or Terri maybe mentioned, conversation earlier. Dialogue is critical. And if you don't even know, if you're saying Black Lives Matter and you don't know the Black community down the street, then there's a serious problem. If you're not opening your doors, especially, you know, look at this chance that you're going to have right as you're reopening, you know, after being sheltered in place. And if you're not opening your doors to the Black community first, saying, come and use our courtyard, we'll sit here with us. We said in our statement, we stand and sit with you. Well, we're doing that. Come first. And we have an open door policy. We want to hear your ideas about how we can partner. We want to repent for what we haven't done. What can we do? Be humble, right? And then be accountable to the community, be accountable internally, be accountable to your staff of color, be accountable to your leadership. And you all have to do the work. It's work. It's not just saying the words and being empathetic. That's not how it works. That's like, cooking a meal without turning on the stove. You can't do it like that.
Preach, Cecile. Cecile, you're speaking the truth. I mean, I just want to own too. I mean, just to back up on that, I want to own how many people, decide the community. I'm going to use a very generic title of the community, right? But like the way people decide what a community needs or wants without engaging in any kind of conversation, right? That they like start the action by like, well, we have this thing and we're going to do this thing. So let's go ahead and just like throw this thing out in the community. And why isn't this being successful? Why isn't this working? Why aren't we getting the responses? To not start with a space, again, I just keep going back to this idea of listening, of asking questions, and not in a question in a way of like, it's on you to do, someone else to do all the work, but to generally receive information and be able to respond and react in a way that is sincere and honest, and quite honestly, not about us. I think that there's just far too much emphasis. I think even with those of us who would consider ourselves very community oriented and very community minded, can still sort of have this air of being so caught up in our own desires. I mean, maybe it's our own desire of engagement work that we're not actually communicating and listening and receiving and then responding to those things and reacting to those things and building with these things. I use the word, another word that gets abused a lot is collaboration, and it's like collaboration is actually skill. It is work. It is difficult. It takes giving up stuff. It takes reconsidering your options. It takes reevaluating. And we don't do that well, and we need to do better at that. And if we really want to open those spaces, if we really want to have this, then the first thing shouldn't be about us. The first thing needs to be about who are we talking to? Who are we reaching out to? And what are they telling us? That needs to be the foundation of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to bring in, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that this whole idea of starting inside your organization is so important. People really need to know what their people are thinking and what their people are feeling and what their people are going through and how their people want to then take that and move it forward through the organizations that they serve in. Because if we just automatically begin to look just outside without assessing what's happening inside, we will definitely make some missteps.
Agreed.
Thank you. So there's a question that came in that I want to dive into a little. It came from Joanne Edwards, the executive director from the Museum of Craft and Design in San Francisco. She said, how did directors of smaller institutions take a manageable piece of the serious issue and affect change that is meaningful? I have more questions than answers, and I want to create a safe platform for discussion with my team. And it feels like we're talking about, like we're right in the midst of talking about this right now. But I think there's also kind of this element of, that's a big institution. They have a crisis management team. They have a chief diversity officer. They have they have all the resources to do so. We're a staff of 10 or 20 or 5. What are the recommendations, or what are the questions that you start with internally to get you to the next phase where you're able to actually hold yourself accountable and take action?
Well, I'd like to say that we also shouldn't assume that even if people look like us and, have the same, trajectory in our work life, or whatever it is, no two people think alike. And you'll be very surprised. And it's not just open dialogue that's going to get you there. You need to have some kind of assessment. in terms of where you are in your approach, what you believe, what your values are, and you have to also align those values with the workplace, right? So there are places that unfortunately have allowed for years, have allowed microaggressions, macroaggressions even, have allowed a terrible work culture to persist. And so whether it's a small organization or a large organization, kind of need to look and assess what your values are and know that that's important if you are going to be changing and going towards a more equitable system. And really, this work is the work of social justice. I always say it, people are asking for DEI plans. And what they really want is they just want a checklist, and they want some of them, excuse me, and they want, more representation of Black and brown bodies in the space. But that is not what it is about at all. All of this is about social justice. And so, everyone has to kind of take a look internally and then honestly and transparently work together to effect change. And so that's going to take time, whether you're a small organization, a large organization, you kind of have to go through the same, there are no easy solutions. And so that means reading, that means, maybe, having book group discussions together, watching documentaries, reading articles, case studies, sort of throwing away your suggestions in your suggestion box or your complaints. You need to look at them very carefully. See what you're doing, get some secret shoppers to tell you, how poorly you might be treating people, wittingly or unwittingly. Look at your systems of power within your museum and eradicate them. And that's what it's going to take, whether it's a museum of 3 employees or 3,000.
What does it mean to come into those conversations?
Go ahead, Damon.
I was just saying, what does it mean to come into those conversations with sincerity and humility? Because I echo what you just sort of said, Cecile, about, let's the assumptions of 2 people that might look alike that are going to think alike, and that's not necessarily going to be the case, right? So and there's going to be things that, I'm quite honestly dealing with this a bit of an issue now, where there's going to be things that you're going to be very convinced that you've done something that was like perfect and it hit all it was a great program or experience and whatever, but for some experience, some people that are there, it's not going to be that. They're going to have a very different read on it, and it was going to be hurtful and trauma-inducing and all of these things. So how do we allow ourselves to receive that criticism? It's about sharing critique, but it's also about like getting that critique and being in a space where you can receive that and creating spaces where we can start to unpack this. Because I think, I heard you say this before, Cecile, too, is that this doesn't have an end game, right? There isn't this, right, coming up with her toy here, but this doesn't have an end game. There isn't this sort of like space that you hit on the chessboard or the game board where it's like, and now you've hit inclusion, and now you've hit perfection, right? Like this is an ever evolving process. So it's how are you building a process that will constantly need to be updated and pursued and travel along to get to always trying to be better, always trying to make it.
Thank you.
I'm a big believer too in the whole idea of there's a whole lot of literature out that can help people get through this. There's some good books out there, and there are incredible documentaries, there are incredible YouTube videos, and I'm a believer in doing that stuff in group, and everyone, reading the book and then having some dialogue about the book. But the other thing, because I was looking at some of the comments that have been coming through, each of us have a merit of control. If you don't like what's going on in your organization, you have the ability to say, I don't like what's going on in this organization, and voting with your feet to no longer work at that organization. And I think we have to be willing to say that I love this job, but this environment does not feed my spirit. Therefore, it's not worth me being in this circumstance and situation. Now, I recognize that I've got some age on people, And I'm in a position to be able to do that. No, I'm being very honest about this, because when you're earlier in your career, you feel a little bit less powerful in your ability to do that. But I think sometimes we do have more power than we think that we do. And sometimes we will find that when we voice something to people, they may not have recognized some of the things that they were doing. It may open a door, is what I'm saying. Or if it doesn't open the door, then you can walk through it, is ultimately where I think people can go when they're working in environments that are just not being supportive.
Thank you. And I know we have a ton of attendees coming from the art world, the Encyclopedic Museum, and one area that I saw a lot of chatter in the chat box earlier was about the actual down to the collections and the historical rooting in injustice that a lot of these institutions have. So I want to hear from Damon, but open it up as well, drawing on your perspective in curatorial and education and as an artist, a cultural producer. The topics of decolonization and provenance have been increasingly in the spotlight over the past few years. And thinking through museums and the role of institutionalized injustice, many museums have fraught history and collections that were acquired through, colonization. And as museums assume the role of educators and activists, and they want to do right and they want to make right, how do they recognize and manage their own past when they are potentially rooted in racism, white supremacy, and violence?
So the idea of managing one's past is an interesting sentence. I don't even know if I have a sort of response for right now, but it's an interesting sort of thing to think about. And maybe at the end of my statement it will make sense. I find this conversation really interesting, and in some ways seem very simple, and in other ways incredibly complex. I don't know how much I believe that at the end of the day, museums can truly, thinking of the big, encyclopedia museum that I work at, whether it could truly be decolonized, because it is just founded in these systems, right? So, maybe in some ways I think of it in terms of what I just said about inclusion work, that it's always a process of getting better. But I think if the goal is to sort of hit this kind of like marker that's going to suddenly make it decolonized, that feels, I don't know if that's possible. I mean, that feels just sort of, that feels complicated to me and maybe unachievable. What I think is very achievable and needs to be done is that we need to be more honest, and we need to be more clear, and we need to own, maybe own's a weird word too, but to articulate the past and articulate the complicated histories that these institutions are created. I just saw someone brought up this idea of decolonizing as a verb instead of a goal, and that makes a lot more sense to me, as it's a process. Again, it's an action. It's a thing that we continually work on. So that really resonates with me. But yeah, I think it's as a starting point. I think owning the history and in that way that we are talking about it. We are not trying to pretend that these things didn't happen. That this isn't part of the history that how these things were created, and how some of these rules were set in place. We need to be able to talk about it. We need to have these discussions. They need to be included in our interpretations and in our sort of standard practice, not just in programs, not just in a moment when we have a lecture or a conversation about it. It needs to be part of how this is all presented and discussed. It needs to be baked into the fabric of what we do, so that we are challenging and that we are actively looking at ways to counter and work against and to delegitimize that process. I'll leave it at that for a start.
Thank you. And Cecile and Terri, do you have anything to add on that concept of decolonizing the museum, or recognizing all of the past that has allowed the museum to get to the current state of, this proud institution of great works and cultures and so on, that is probably and likely at odds with some of the things that they're trying to do in the areas of doing right by all and owning up to the past?
Yes, it's definitely a reckoning, which, some museums are just not ready to face, some museums who still, have very, very few, members of their staff who are people of color, or they, I've heard museum personnel say there's no such thing as racism, or they still don't, it's for some reason, I still feel no compassion or no compulsion based on the events of the last several weeks. I want to read a quote attributed to, I'm not sure, but by Malcolm X. And he said, if you stick a knife 9 inches into my back and pull it out 3 inches, that is not progress. Even if you pull it all the way out, that is not progress. Progress is healing the wound, and America, and I would say museums writ large, hasn't even begun to pull out the knife. They have not really come to terms, again, that this is about social justice. This is about justice. And it really doesn't have anything to do with checking off how many people are in your museum. And until they get from that stage to understanding, how all of, that we, as, and I'm going to say as African descended people, we're looted ourselves, and the components, the creations of our culture were looted and brought here. There's just a lot to unpack, and some museums are not yet at the stage where they're willing to understand and accept that, but it must be done. It must be done. And it's not just compassion and knowledge that will get you there. It's action. And it's nothing can be changed until it's faced, like you were saying. Right. A quote by
James Baldwin. Yeah.
Right.
Well, one point that keeps coming up in even one's ability to take that step forward is the composition of those who work there, those who lead, those who govern. And we have a question from another anonymous attendee that our board and communities need to diversify to include more Black and Brown members and reflect the community in which they live. What strategies can we employ to recruit diverse board members when our current members don't have the diverse networks to bring those people in?
Well, I'm sure that there are other organizations beyond just the museum and the museum's board's networks that you can access to begin to determine who would be a good choice for your governing board. Boards are funny, though. They create bylaws and rules that can perpetuate issues, and those can be very, very hard to tackle. I think actually utilizing people like Cecile to come in and talk to your board often can be more revealing than you trying to do it from the inside yourself. But can I also, I want to just go off of the board piece for just a second, because I was just thinking, we're talking about, increasing numbers, if you will, of people who are representative of the community. What about all these vendor relationships that museums have? How about throwing some business to minority-owned operations who have the ability to do the work? And I hate when people will say, well, they're not really big enough to, that's a crock. If you want to bring people into the museum to do the service, you can do that. And I think far too many people tend to not think about their vendor relationships. They may think about it from who's catering, but that's not enough. We're not just talking about a caterer. We're talking about the people who help your museum run. And there are vendors out there who are minority vendors, African-American vendors, who have the ability to service your museum, and that is a really good, tangible start. And it's even measurable. So you could set a metric for yourself of how much you're going to increase your minority vendors. over the course of a period of time.
I love that. I love that idea. Is I feel like that's not an obvious, or it's not an obvious next step. Is one of the things that I love about it, beyond it being the right thing to do and an easy starting point. I feel like, and let me know if this is safe to say, Zuri, like that's how a lot of cities and governments award RFPs. Like it's a requirement.
Yeah.
It's a way to make sure that the business is being, equitably distributed across, all groups, but especially those that are minority owned and operated small businesses. So that's I love this point. I love that point. Thank you. And Cecile, you wanted to say something on top of that. And Damon.
Really quickly. Sorry. So I would say too that only, hiring caterers or custodians, you're reinforcing stereotypes and you're revealing some things about, yourselves as leaders or as an organization, when that's what you ordinarily go to. And part of this building capacity in the field and making room, for curators of color, for other leaders of color, you really need to look out there. We are not that hard to find. And in terms of boards, boards aren't just about fundraising. They're also about friend raising. It's about wealth, wisdom, and work. It's about all of those things. And so you don't need to look just in the usual places or the usual kinds of board members. I was so inspired by Killer Mike, who gave a powerful speech about, 10 days ago, who is a board member at the High Museum of Art. He may not have said that, but I happen to know. And actually, I'm part of the Facing Change program at the American Alliance of Museums, where as a fellow, I am involved with several museums in the Chicago area. My area is Chicago. And we are in the business of helping boards to make sure that, they understand all of this. They're learning together as a cohort, and then they will do some board matching and find board members who are, they're committed to finding at least 2 ethnically and racially diverse board members, if not more. So it takes work and it takes time, but we're not that hard to find, and do some stretching, be creative.
Yeah, and I hope if someone could grab the link to the Killer Mike video, what was that, like end of May in Atlanta. It's an incredibly moving speak. And I also think T.I. is in that video by his side, which is, anyways, great video to watch.
Can I
so I'm glad that,
Sorry if I can just chime into that conversation, because I want to bring up too, when we talk about diversifying our workforce, I just really want to also add, like, what does that mean beyond the idea of quotas, beyond the idea of numbers, and what does it mean? I think I've seen so many, just personally from my experience and conversations with young would-be curators across the country young Black men and women that will start these curatorial fellowships at different institutions, and then start leaving the museum world immediately following it and going into, whether it's gallery work or whether it's other arts organizations, trying to find how they can continue their love of curatorial work outside the museum work, because we're not creating structures that actually supports that leadership. You say we want these positions, but that actually involves cultural shift as well, right? That involves making sure that you're creating a space that is not going to be hostile or, I will just say, speaking for myself very personally, I'm the first full-time employee, the first African-American full-time employee at my museum to hold a curatorial title. I'm also the first Black person to be running the education department now, even in this interim role. And what does that mean? And I have learned a lot in a period of time, and I think it's easy to kind of look up and talk about sort of systems of oppression and microaggressions that come from above. But I will be honest in this conversation just to say that I have experienced it from below and from the sides as well, and that is larger work that needs to be done. How it's not just how do we get people into this field, it's how do we keep them? How do you make sure you can stay, and that is something that to be honest, I'm struggling with myself. That is hard space, and that's the work that's not being done. it's great that all these fellowship and sort of opportunities have come up, but we have to do this other work, you know?
Well, you know, the idea, I think, of self-care is really important. And knowing what to surround yourself with and what not to surround yourself with, because it can be totally draining and sapping of all of your energy. You know, I have had the experience in a variety of roles that I have played, not just here at the museum, where it's not the people at the top that are the biggest issues. It's the people in the middle sometimes that are the biggest issues, because the perception is, okay, so here's the flavor of the month. I'll just wait it out until there's a new person at the top, and you know, we'll move on. So I think Damon's point about getting it from the sides and below is very, very real. And again, this whole idea of self-care and what we're surrounding ourselves with, I think where we've got to get to is actually seeing everyone as a human being. If we can just see people as human beings, fellow humans, we would be able to treat people a lot better, as opposed to focusing on all of these different things that make us who we are. Let's talk about what we do all have as our root, which is our humanness. And I think that that's what has just been the tipping point in this instance, is that people have just said, damn it, I'm tired of not being treated as a human being, and I'm not going to deal with this any longer. So I think that's where we have to get to in this country. But it's going to take work, and it's not going to be done. You know, somebody is keeping a list of all the statements that are being written. There will be people who come back around and say, do you recall that you said X, Y, and Z? We've been watching. And I think that that is totally and wholly appropriate. So from some of the comments that I'm seeing here, there are people who are on this seminar who can hold their organizations accountable by simply saying, well, you know, we wrote this statement. Now what are we going to do?
Thank you. Thank you. And we only have a couple more minutes. So I want to make some very, very brief closing notes that after this webinar, we'll compile everyone's questions and ideas and solutions. And there's a lot of reading material. There's a lot of video. There's a lot of material to look at into one living and breathing document for the community to share and to comment and to discuss. So feel free to share your thoughts and questions here in the webinar, or email them over to hello@Cuseum. I want to mention that in the upcoming weeks, we'll be bringing together an array of voices for what we call a live think tank session, where we bring together museum professionals and social innovators outside of the museum field to bring together to spark some new ideas. On a quick little note about what, Terri, you were saying about your vendors, one of the individuals is the founder of a company in Boston called Resilient Coders that trains Black and people of color for high growth careers in software. So when people ask me from museums, hey, we need our website done, you know, there are organizations that are in line with that value and in line with that type of mission. So I just wanted to make a side note about that. But we plan on hosting this, you know, about how museums can be incubators for social change and social impact and all. I hope if folks are available next week that you'll join us. And if there are any voices ever that you want to hear from, we're always listening. We're always open to your suggestions. So please let me know. And the fact that everyone is here today, you know, shows that you're taking proactive steps in preparing your museum and bettering your museum and preparing yourself and bettering yourself. But we all know there's a lot of work to be done. It isn't just signing on to a webinar and listening. There is action that needs to be taken. So in these last moments, I'm hoping that Damon, Cecile, and Terri can each leave us with one idea that we can take back to our organizations, or take back to our families, or take back to ourselves individually. So Damon, I'd love to start with you.
I'm going to stick with listen. I think that is the foundation of all of this. Listen, 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 and don't listen to have a response. Don't listen to have an answer. Don't listen to plan an attack. Listen to listen and to learn. And if I have to just say really quickly that I came into this panel having a very rough day, and I wasn't sure that I was going to actually be able to do it. And I just want to thank my co-conspirators here and my colleagues and offer, I would love for us to continue this conversation and to do this again in a couple months and to just take a temperature. And I value you guys so much. So thank you for letting me share some space.
Thank you, Damon. And Cecile, I'd love to hear your thoughts on one takeaway or action item, maybe an action item, because that's critical right now.
Thank you. Yes, and I also just want to thank you and thank everyone for such a thoughtful, inspiring, and energetic discussion. I would say, my takeaway is just make the moment monumental. And I know that's kind of pun intended, make sure it's a monument to the right values and the right beliefs and the right direction. Make sure you tear down anything that doesn't affirm. Make sure that as staff, you are emotionally, psychologically, and physically safe. That unless you feel that within your institution, you can't really make true progress. And again, it's not a checklist. It's a life and a life affirming endeavor. So that's what I would leave with you today. And just again, thanks so much for allowing me the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Cecile. And Terri, love to hear your thoughts on these closing takeaways and ideas and action items that people can bring back with them today.
I think mine is really a ditto to Damon about listening. But if there is one action, it would be listening to the community around you and finding out what the community thinks about how you're contributing to the issues or helping resolve the issues. And then make some action plans to move forward off of what you find.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Damon. Thank you, Cecile, and thank you, Terri. I am, unbelievably inspired by the conversation that took place today. I know I personally have a lot to learn and have a lot of things to strive for as an individual and as a leader, of a company. And as someone with a place in this overall cultural community and community at large. So I really appreciate the opportunity to engage in a dialogue with all three of you and those who have chimed in or voiced an opinion or shared a document or shared a thought or asked a question. I really value these types of conversations, and I equally hope that there are more of these to come. So thank you so much. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope to see you again soon, and be safe, be well. Thank you.